All right. Welcome back to episode number 5 of the Gathering podcast by StartWell. This time around, I thought we'd flip the script, turn things inside out. We are sitting down in our podcast studio with a podcaster, and her name is Amanda Cupido. Cupido?
Cupido.
Cupido, hey!
That's right, Italian.
There we go. I did that a few guests ago with someone who wasn't Italian, and then he was like, yeah, that I get that a lot, but
Not me.
I'm like Hungarian.
Oh, no.
But it still sounded great.
Yeah.
So welcome to the studio, a studio that you've known for a while.
That's right.
That has changed since
It's
you've been here.
amazing. I'm so impressed.
It's all black now.
Yes, and you got the proper soundproofing. You got the whole camera set up.
Yeah.
It's looking really good.
Yeah, we pimped it out. And I think the reasons why we did that are going to unfold in this conversation because I think it's something that it sounds like, you're helping people figure out.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with introductions.
Yes.
So aside from being, a StartWell alumni, catch us up on kind of like your career in podcasting. It came from radio.
Yes.
And then from radio into podcasting.
That's right.
And I think a lot of people that come into podcasting as, a source of entertainment don't necessarily know about the medium's history.
That's right.
And the industry around it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dig into everything by answering one question.
Okay.
One question only.
Oh, gosh.
And that is podcasting ? How did you get into podcasting? Let's just start there.
So I was in talk radio in Toronto. I was a producer, made my way through the newsroom as a news anchor and a reporter. And so obviously I had a lot of the skills needed to create podcasts, which was, recording, editing. And so I kind of fell into podcasting. I was making a podcast. My first one was more than 10 years ago now. And I was doing it for a magazine that was trying to up its digital presence. Mm-hmm. And so I made one, and there, just because I had those bare bones skills. Mm-hmm. But at the time I was, I had a question mark around podcasting too, as a lot of people did. And so it was a really slow start, and then it just word of mouth. I started getting little side clients to make podcasts for while I was still working in radio. But I would say everything for me changed around 2014. Yep. So this was a big year for podcasting. Number one, Serial was released and broke all sorts of records.
Serial?
The podcast, yes.
I don't know anything about that. And I'll just pause you there because, the way that I found podcasting was as a DJ coming out in the 90s looking for an easy way to push mixes out to my audience.
Interesting, yep.
And so I had a record label called IndianElectronica.com, and we were global. People loved us everywhere.
Yep.
And so, RSS syndication, of course, we're familiar with that in terms of how do blogs ping servers and let people know the latest post is available. Mm-hmm. And that's where podcasting kind of came from. Yeah. It was just an RSS feed.
That's right.
With a media wrapper for a media file, right? Mm-hmm. And so my first podcast was in 2002 or 3, and it was just a DJ mix series. Right. But so I came into it from this I need to push this content out.
Yes.
And what's the technical medium
to do so, right?
Not thinking about.
It's interesting, and I find a lot of people come in from the sides that way, and I guess I took more of that journalistic route in, which was 2014 being, Serial, this investigative crime story out of the U.S., and it's, gone on to other seasons, but season 1 was the one that won a Peabody Award and got, hit all sorts of Apple records for downloads, hosted by Sarah Koenig, who has gone on to being, very well known for her podcast hosting. And
so this is the reference point for Only Murders in the Building. Is that it?
Totally. Okay. Yeah. And so it was looking into this crime, this person, Anand Syed, who was claiming that he was in prison wrongfully for a crime that he committed. And actually, just recently, he was released from prison after being in there for a while. So this made waves in the podcast space from a journalistic perspective. At that same time, we saw Apple make moves from a tech perspective, which is that podcasts used to be just within the Apple Music button, and it was a separate tab. And then Apple extrapolated that and made podcast its separate button on all Apple devices. So
Yeah,
that
so
little purple square with the
Yeah.
right that
Like
became
iTunes birthed podcasts.
yeah,
And it's changed since then.
that's right.
Right.
And so the word podcast being iPod and broadcast podcast. So Apple was really leading the charge in pushing the medium, and it plateaued, right? So those early 2000s, it was starting, but then we didn't, it was listed as word of the year in 2005. So there was this early, excitement around it, but it plateaued, and then we saw around 2014 this little shoot, this bump. It's shooting up in popularity. So partially because there was some great content being made, partially because of the tech implications of it. And around that time too, we saw in North America, especially in the US, a lot of production companies coming out and saying, we're just going to be dedicated to making podcasts. And so Gimlet is a company that is now owned by Spotify, but they were emerging and starting to put some groundwork into their own shows and making their company.
So that's a content production studio and publishing company.
That's right. And so they do original shows and have a lot of popular ones like Reply All and Science Versus, and they have a whole suite of shows that are now exclusively on Spotify. So that's the business acquisition era was later, and that's more recent, like what we're in now. But so at that time, I started really closely paying attention to the industry from a business perspective, where I started saying, wait a second. And at that time, I was also working in branded content, doing video.
Okay.
Out of an agency in Toronto.
I didn't know that, actually. I didn't know there was
Yes.
a video element there.
Well, I was just in my background, So I was overseeing a video production team. It was with a company called MediaFace, and we were doing branded content. And I just said, why don't we launch a podcast vertical and let's start doing branded podcasts? At the time, I still think in Canada it was a bit too early.
Yeah.
We were still explaining to clients what is a podcast, which is not a great place to start when you're trying to sell something.
Yeah, you never want to explain what you're selling.
No.
Oh, my God.
It was tough. We did sell a couple, but that's where I started getting into the mix of really being strategic with building out show development in line with business, marketing, communication strategies, and how can a podcast accomplish all of those things without sounding like a giant ad and checking all those boxes at the same time and really cut through the noise in a meaningful way and do some great storytelling. So, and I started paying attention to the industry quite closely, and from there, I wrote my book in 2018, Let's Talk Podcasting, The Essential Guide to Doing It Right. That took me 2 years to write, so I started plugging away at it around 2016. But then once the book came out, that kind of, shot up my presence in the space, and I ended up starting to speak at conferences, both in Canada and the US, and talking about podcasting and starting to really get a lot of businesses and thought leaders on board. Yeah.
Let's talk about this book.
Okay.
Okay, because at the time, was the impetus to share kind of your knowledge and the journey that you've been on with podcasts, or was it educational? Like, is it like catharsis? Is it education? Or was it just, even a business sense? Like you got a deal and you had to write something.
Yeah, it was a mix of several things. At the time, I was also in talks of being brought on to Seneca College to revamp their journalism and radio program to incorporate podcasts. And there was actually no text that I could really champion, especially in Canada, a Canadian podcast book. So that made sense from a learning perspective.
Yep.
And actually, I didn't have myself at all in it, really. And that was one of my notes from my publisher to say, you got to put more of yourself into it. So it was less about me and more just, here are some shows that we can listen to and learn from. Here are some tactical approaches to how to do this thing. Here's what the Canadian landscape looks like. Here's what ads look like. I really just spelled out. I have a glossary at the end, so it really was a 101 for someone who wanted to get started. But then, if people have read the book, they'll know that I then put in a whole chapter on like behind the scenes of me making one of my shows, and I walk it through each of my steps. I include transcripts of like raw audio versus edited audio that I was doing for one of my shows. So I really did pull back the curtain as well. So it is, I don't think there's any other book out there like it.
I haven't come across anything. There's definitely nothing in our library here at StartWell.
I gave them a book. There is, yeah, it's there. So yeah, and I mean, at that point, I was always toying with starting and scaling. It was really just me doing everything end to end at that point. Right. And in 2020 is when I decided, you know what, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna scale, and so I launched Lead Podcasting.
2020.
Yep.
Very impactful year.
Indeed. A lot of people's lives changed that year.
And a lot of ears opened for podcasts, I'm guessing.
It's true, yeah. So we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, listenership actually dropped. And I think that's more so due to people's routines changing and they didn't really know what to do, when to listen. But within 3 months, we saw it going back up and then it very quickly surpassed where it was previously.
Right.
And so now we've seen that upward trajectory continuing since then.
Tell me a little bit about audio podcasting versus video podcasting for that kind of dedicated subscriber. It's a tough one also. It's a loaded question, and I'll
Yes.
tell you what I think about it after.
Yeah, I'm curious. And I mean, there's no right or wrong. This is an art at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
certain projects, I think, lend themselves better to certain approaches. And that's what I like to talk through with some of our clients, too. I am an audio purist at heart. And so I do tend to default to audio only.
Yeah.
But there is a time and space for video. And as long as I think sometimes people just default to video because that's what they're more familiar with.
Right.
And so that's where I go, why are you making the choice to include video? What are you going to do with that video? What are you hoping to accomplish with having that video complementing the audio?
Yeah, exactly. It has to complement it because assuming that the audio is the primary thing, because otherwise it's very difficult to utilize cinematography if you're just setting up a camera in the corner of the room and two people talking. It could take the listeners completely away from what they're hearing.
And also with guests, we find that some people are just, when you put a camera and you put the lights, they change.
Oh, yeah.
So depending on who you're asking to come to the
they,
mic,
Amanda?
as I put on lipstick before this interview. But yeah, and so it does change the energy. And if you're talking to a really vulnerable community, if you're trying to bring people who are not media trained, who've not done this before, it can be quite intimidating. Whereas if you're just going with a microphone or even just a lav mic, they forget it's there and you're able to get to the heart of the matter. So it definitely depends on what kind of people you're inviting to be on the show, even the host's own comfort levels. Some hosts really love to have their notes everywhere. And then knowing that the camera's on them, they're not going to look or they're going to feel frazzled. So a lot of the clients I work with have never done a podcast before. And so having no camera takes the pressure off a bit. And it's like, have your sticky notes, have your, whatever you need around you.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about it. So, and you're not focusing on your hair and you're focusing on what you're saying. And that's what's really important.
Yeah.
And, And so, I think, the traditional approach to podcasting, some people will say, oh, if there's a video, it's not a podcast, but, that debate can go on forever, but I'm open to both.
Yeah. I mean, like, I see it like they are completely different things.
Yeah.
Because I would totally ignore the crappy video podcast and say it's just a poor use of the medium, and say what you're going for is something that, if it's a video podcast, it's got to have, it's serialized video content, but ideally building on the ethos of audio podcasts, which is serialized content that still enables the audience's minds to imagine things. Because I think that's the big sell for audio only, is that you're listening and you kind of take it in your own brain. Yeah. And video is very difficult to do that without an understanding of cinematography and, a kind of a controlled environment for filming and stuff like that.
Exactly.
But then in terms of the publishing medium, I think this is really interesting where lately, Gus, the way I look at it is like, video definitely killed every type of star. Lately, in the last, let's call it 5 years, as video technology, and filmmaking has become more affordable and so on. And we're seeing video clips and content everywhere in mass media. So there was this adoption of kind of like video, and then it drove industry things where Spotify opened up video podcasting not long ago, like a year ago, I think, right?
And in Canada, only very recently, yeah.
Yeah, so we were one of the first people that were like invited to start sending stuff up to the servers, and it was such a discordant, broken system because I guess it was through an acquisition. They acquired, I forget what the name of the company was.
They've acquired a ton of companies, and that's why too. It's them trying to put the puzzle pieces together as they've brought on all these different companies to try to take podcasting to the next level.
And what's so interesting is that, like, your average person will probably know big names in podcasts. They'll know Joe Rogan. He's a podcaster. He has a podcast.
Right.
And it's they might know it because they caught it on YouTube somewhere. Someone sent them a clip, and they just think of it like a show. Yeah. Right. But the interesting thing is, I don't even know if that's a video podcast, like it's published as a video podcast through Spotify.
Yeah, because now Spotify owns the show.
And because the other thing is this, technically it's a pain in the butt to upload massive video files, to then have those video files still be distributed in the same way as the audio is, which is when a new one is ready on the feed, it gets pulled down to your local device.
Right.
Everyone is running out of space on every device, so I think that's
a 3-hour video isn't gonna.
Yeah, it's a bit of a broken medium,
Yeah.
and is definitely something that I'm quite expecting YouTube to pick up on, is like creating a new form of this like VOD subscriber based, personal channel
Yes.
thing. But anyway, so we'll leave it there.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about this kind of, I guess, could go back to your story.
Okay.
You were at the book, right?
Yes.
In terms of like relating the Amanda story.
Right. And so following the book, at that time I was working full-time in communications with World Vision, a nonprofit. And I was really pushing podcasts as an entrepreneur at that time and carving out a new path for this legacy organization, and being able to do podcasts on the side. I started to teach and really, which I loved, influencing like the next generation of audio storytellers. So started teaching at Seneca, and then also started teaching at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University. And so during that time, then the pandemic hit. I flipped to virtual teaching, which was, an interesting experience in and of itself.
Were your classes delivered audio only?
That's why I said we don't even need the video.
Turn your cameras off. Everyone, turn your cameras off. Just listen to me.
But I did think it lended itself well to virtual learning. I didn't feel I was missing on getting the power of my lessons across, because we were able to still really accomplish that. And so, and from the feedback I heard from my students, I think they felt the same. And at that time, I ended up taking a buyout from World Vision. It was a tough time for a lot of businesses, especially charities, and that's what I used. And that's at the time that I said, okay, and I'm going to go full tilt podcasting now.
Right.
And so launched Lead Podcasting, and immediately it started growing. I hired my first full-time employee within months of incorporating. Yeah.
So tell us about Lead Podcasting. What does Lead Podcasting do?
Yes. So we create podcasts that help build your leadership profile. Basically, we work with organizations and leaders in really helping them find their voice, and create a show that cuts through the noise. And like I said, kind of aligns with some of those business strategies, but does it in a way that doesn't feel slimy, that's really great storytelling, that audiences will truly love. And what's interesting, too, is that when we take this approach, we also try to put some really clear key performance indicators in there of what do we see as success. And a lot of times it's not just making the top 10 Apple charts.
Right, yeah.
They have a lot of other goals that they're trying to reach, and it's also talking them through, how is this podcast going to achieve some of those business goals? Mm-hmm. And let's be really clear on what we're trying to do here and have one clear priority of what this is going to do. And that's going to dictate what I like to talk about, the listener journey, the listener experience. We have the user experience on web pages. So after they listen to the podcast, what are you hoping people do? And being really clear on that. And so sometimes, I have had leaders who use podcasts just to increase SEO on their website.
Sure. They
don't want to write blogs. They like to talk, a podcast, transcribe it, bang, you're done. I've had people who are wanting to make heavy documents more accessible, and the information in them, annual reports, research studies, right? Yeah, which can be really dense and have some really cool findings, but it's just, it takes the time, and it might be buried a bit. And so it's like, how do we bring this to life? So I've worked with Cisco on that, highlighting cybersecurity research findings. That was one of my first contracts with Lead Podcasting.
Crazy.
So it's great, interesting information about cybersecurity that the average person wouldn't have really been able to know how to find through Cisco's website.
Right.
But we were able to really put it out there in a digestible format. And so sometimes, that's, again, was just hoping to help push the industry forward and build awareness. We've also had people who are wanting to drive a sale for sure, and that's a more traditional, you have a research, you have a discount code at the end. But yeah, a lot of times it does end up being these kind of offshoot goals of that lead to connections with audience in different ways.
I think it's so interesting, though, that we're having this conversation, because always, since my 20 years in podcasting, I've always thought that the medium not particularly like the content could be anything, but the idea of having an audience member subscribe to your content, especially in such a direct way. Like podcasting is always like, it's a very personal thing in the sense that people carry your media around with you. And now, I mean, you can watch it on their TVs and stuff like that, but it's a very kind of interactive, intimate, experience that people have. So within companies and between companies, and for companies, brands, their relationship with their customers to be strengthened with this as a communication medium, I think is so fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful.
So are there any examples of within company usage, like, CMO who wants to kind of like push out updates to his marketing team that's globally distributed kind of thing?
Yeah, you're bang on. So we've done a lot of internal podcasting, as it's referred to, where we're making podcasts for companies who want to build community within their organization. So a recent one that we're working on right now is with Sleeman Breweries. And so it's great. They're on to season 2, and they've got so many employees, and the C-suite executives can feel far removed sometimes. And so being able to sit them down, have a chat, have a beer, talk about what they like with their head of communications, it's purely for their staff. So if you look this up, you're not going to find it.
Right.
And again, that's another one where the goal wasn't to crack a top 10 list, but it was more so to really reach this specific group of people, have them feel more connected, and ultimately feel you got a bunch of marketers for your company right there. If they feel like they really believe in it, that they know they could talk about what the brand is doing, they'll feel in the loop, in the know, and what's to come. And so that's another thing that, a lot of, I know internal communications, a lot of times there might be C-suites who do a video, and even sometimes that can feel a little bit too slickly produced and too put on, where this kind of a conversation just humanizes leadership. And brings them together. So like Shopify has an internal podcast. We also did an internal podcast for World Vision when I was there.
Right.
And so that was great because that was the first one that I made, and I got to use that as a case study, as a starting point. And with an international team like that, which is huge and spans over 100 countries around the world, audio, going back to what you were saying about dense files.
Yeah.
We are working in countries where the internet is not that great.
Oh, yeah.
And so videos are tough to get through, but audio is just that much more accessible.
Right.
Yeah.
Small file size, and people are on the go in different places around the world, especially if their work demands it.
Yeah.
So listening on the plane, in the,
And even being able to record with them, right? A lot of them didn't have a solid video feed because of their internet, but audio, if we just focused on that, was more likely we were going to get a clean recording with them and be able to include them in.
I think also, especially if the show is kind of not just like leaders, presenting
Yes.
banter
Staff
constantly.
involvement is huge.
Yeah, so like being able to solicit perspectives and then share those amongst the whole team through this single channel is awesome.
And what was so special was, the podcast that I did with World Vision International, the internal one, I was co-hosting alongside the CEO of World Vision International. And so we kind of tag team segments, and I was producing it. And when I was doing outreach to some people that were working in the field in Lebanon and in the field, in all these places around the world, to say, come onto the podcast, you're going to have a chat with the CEO. They feel so special to get even that 15 minutes of a one-on-one conversation they would have never really gotten otherwise. It's so rare. And so that's like, for them, was such a big deal. And then their entire team is so proud that someone was getting represented. And so they're going to be sharing it internally and having people come alongside and cheer them on. And so it really did do some magic, and seeing their reaction and how proud they were when the episodes came out.
Right.
Like, I'm like, there it is.
It's like a whole other thing to socialize within the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been helping a few customers in the same bent, particularly in this studio, but then also doing crazy stuff over at the new one. I don't think you've seen this.
I haven't. We're going to have to do a tour.
Oh, it's epic.
Cool.
It's kind of exhaustingly epic because it's...
exhaustingly epic.
Yeah, and so us creating this 3,500 square foot dedicated white psych for film and like motion and stills. Well, that was the main impetus. Not so much audio first. We created this big space because of a few reasons. One was it was supposed to be an office space, then the tenant pulled out, and then the pandemic happened. So I was sitting on this big building, and I wanted to get my chops up on a lot of production techniques. So I was like, okay, we're going black magic. We got all this black magic gear, and I started filming different things in the space, and then testing it with creators, and creators love the studio. And then now we're the studio choice for brands like NYX and stuff. So that's really cool.
Awesome. Good for you guys.
But exhausting in the sense that your conventional studio environment for visual media requires setup and teardown each time, And so we got all this gear and we could do all sorts of amazing stuff. But when you want to create serialized content, typically that then means that you've got to, pack heavy shoot days back to back to preload your series. And you're recording like 10 hours a day to cut 10 episodes, hopefully if you're lucky, all that jazz. So in that experience, we kind of like jazzed up this studio. It said, as a controlled environment, to just jump on the mic.
Yep.
And what we found in doing that, and in releasing StartWell's podcast as a video series as well now on YouTube and stuff, is a lot of our network of influence is kind of, enjoying the content, but also saying, wow, you have the utility of the room, of the studio, and obviously production services. So maybe we could do something. And that's where all these conversations have started. And it's amazing to just brainstorm on what the communication problems almost are in organizations and how they can be served by this medium.
Yeah.
I think there's massive potential.
For sure. And I think a lot of the barriers to people starting this type of work is that tech barrier. And so having something like this all set up where it's a plug and play, I think taking away, and I'm just a champion of this sort of storytelling, and that's what we try to do too, in saying, okay, we're going to take care of all that hard stuff for you and just come. And so that's why having this available, and even as someone so my company, we do pure remote recording.
Like on location normally?
No, like virtual recording.
Okay, so let's break that down.
Yeah, and there is still a real big value to this. So I was about to say, I might use this because sometimes we do need a studio and I don't have one, so we need a place to rent out.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, we could talk more about this. But because we launched in the pandemic, we had to do it virtually, and then a lot of my clients, and there was a couple of them that I had been working with individually in person, and I would do a pop-up studio is kind of how so I have a little kit that I would bring, and we would do it in their office, and there is a benefit to that too. You're comfortable, again, someone who might not be experienced behind a mic, doing it in a space that you're really comfortable in can help take that pressure off. But so that's how I was kind of approaching it before, but then when everyone went virtual, they just all wanted to stay that way.
So what does that mean? Like what was your stack when you're kind of remote, you're doing calls essentially?
Yeah.
Is like, let's talk tech stack, just to inform our audience who are considering, producing their own show.
Yep.
Across the border and like not in a studio. So
we use CleanFeed, which is an audio only recording platform. And that's, again, intentional. We have a pro account, but there's also free account. So if people want to go and play around with it, have at her. I find it is the best audio recording software. And we did use this at the radio station. It's obviously evolved since then. To record audio only, there's nothing to download for anyone. It's browser-based. And you can record in multi-track. As someone who's running the recording session, I have control over everyone's audio levels. I have filters I can apply. If someone doesn't have headphones, I can put on a no headphone filter. I can load up clips and have people react to them and play them in and have it part of the recording. So there's a lot of great CleanFeed. And how do
you get around the problem of mics?
So honestly, CleanFeed, the way it records, even if you don't have a mic, it sounds really good. You wouldn't know.
That's shocking.
You wouldn't know. And like and even with a simple USB mic, it's great. Now, like AirPod mics, no. Right. I would rather go no. I've experimented a lot with it, obviously. So even with, I'd rather go no mic, no headphones than an AirPod situation. And so, but usually what we recommend, we give a recommendation. Usually our host will have a mic, and then guests we're going to troubleshoot. But you know what? Now a lot of people have USB mics.
Yeah.
So
post-pandemic, people have had to like kit out their home office setup.
So most of our guests end up having them, and even when they don't, they sound really good.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's how we record, and then we edit in Adobe Audition,
Okay.
and that's really it.
What? Adobe has an audio editor? Well, we have full, Adobe CS, of course.
Yes.
But I never would have thought of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. They have an audio editor.
Mm-hmm.
I
So that's
honestly
what it
have
is.
never checked it out. I'm so old school. I'm like, I don't even remember. Acid and SoundForge were my tools of choice back in the
Wow.
day. And then Sony bought them. And then, the software development languished.
Yep.
And since then, the only other linear audio editor that I've used outside of my video suite, so outside of like Blackmagic, which has this amazing
Oh, cool.
audio functionality, especially for cinematic audio and stuff, but is Audacity,
Yes.
open source free one.
Which is great, and I recommend that to a lot of people. And you're able to do. That's how I started in podcasting. I was editing on Audacity, but once you want to get to doing a little more treatment and having some more creative license to do stuff, Audition's where we've gone.
Crazy, man.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the publishing flow, like
Yeah.
typically, what do you recommend these days?
It's different every time.
Because I throw a bunch of stuff on our server. Like, it's all on our server. If my server goes down, it's all dead.
Yeah. I hope that doesn't happen to you.
It has happened.
Oh, no.
It happened with my record label. That label that I mentioned, Indian
Yeah.
Electronic. We had over 60,000 subs.
No.
And then the server went down because I didn't renew the domain name.
Shoot.
And someone in Japan snipered it
No.
for ads. And then I couldn't get the
Oh.
domain for I don't know how many years. And then it took me like 2 years when I got the domain back. So now that's live again. To source even my mixes. Because I didn't even have backups.
Wow. Okay. Well, you got to back up.
So
But
I think we're missing like 5 episodes.
Yeah.
But
Oh, no.
but it's been reborn.
Good.
And yeah, once again, it's exactly like before. Everything's sitting on the server.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, if we're getting into the nitty gritty of what the tech setup is on our side for lead podcasting, we have Dropbox. So everything is in Dropbox from a archiving perspective.
Yep.
And then we publish to Libsyn is most of our clients or our own shows tend to go there. There is a monthly fee to that. There's a ton of different podcast hosting platforms. Libsyn is the oldest and, has been in the game for a long time. It looked, and you could tell up until recently, they just, redid their website and their dashboard, which is great. But yes, there has been some podcast hosting platforms that have just gone down or even just been unavailable for random 24 hours. And so that's always something you got to be mindful of. We've been really happy with working with Libsyn, and none of this is paid, by the way. This is just genuinely what we use.
Sure, yeah.
Anchor is free.
Anchor FM.
Yes. And that's, I recommend that for people who are trying to do something and keep it really cheap and cheerful. There is no cost associated, but once you get into some of those monetization routes, and you got to just make sure you are reading the fine print. But once they got purchased, the Anchor got bought by Spotify. So once that happened,
That's the platform that's running their video.
okay.
Yeah.
So once that happened, that's when I said, okay, because I was always hesitant of where am I putting it up and will this company be there
Right.
for the long run?
Yeah.
Once they were purchased by Spotify, I started having more confidence in that and recommending that to people who were, for instance, sometimes we do a lead podcasting accelerator course for individuals rather than larger businesses. And it's like a cohort that will go through this 10-week program. And by the end of it, they have a full season, their first season
That's
of their show.
awesome.
It's really cool.
Did you run that seasonally or how does it work?
Seasonally, we did it twice this year. So fall and a winter cohort. Next year, it's looking like we'll just do one in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do 2 workshops, then you have access to the lead podcasting producers, and we record and edit for you, and then you get 5-part series plus a trailer, and then do a workshop on like marketing and uploading.
Mm-hmm.
And so our recent little cohort just graduated, so congrats to all of them. But so for them, for instance, we're saying Anchor's a great route. You're testing out podcasting. Usually this is your first season. You're trying to do it usually on a budget. Let's go. We're going to walk you through Anchor. And so we point them towards that route. And Anchor does have a lot of neat things that you can do, like polls, but that's again only on Spotify. So it's also being mindful of, okay, you got to know they're in bed with Spotify. And
Right. Where's your audience?
Where is your audience? And like, what are you going to tap into, and just recognize that not everyone might be able to take part in that element of it. So you just got to manage that. But another interesting thing with that integration with Spotify and Anchor is that music licensing for podcasting, I mean, this is a whole other topic, but briefly, I will say it's quite tough, and there's no overarching global body that's granting you licenses. And so unless you're going directly to the artist and the record label, it's really tough. And so people who are wanting to just do a music podcast and talk about music, it's really tough if you can't play the song.
Yeah, for sure.
And you will get ripped down right away because there's all these AI tactics and you know.
You get your own server.
Yeah, right. But, you'll still, like Apple itself, if you're syndicating to Apple could take it down. So anyway, Spotify has done this very interesting, workaround. I don't think this will be around forever, but in the interim, it's integrated with Anchor so that you can throw to a song. And as long as that song is on Spotify, you plug it in and you upload your episode in chunks.
Yeah.
And so when the listener is listening to it, it will switch from your podcast to the song to back to the podcast.
Oh, poor artist.
And then it puts it in. I mean, that's a whole other debate.
Yeah, exactly,
so we can leave
right?
it there for now. But interesting, these workworkarounds that are emerging,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
crazy. I never heard of that.
Yeah.
That's really nuts.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I really think that that podcasting has a lot to offer in the world, in the corporate world, now that teams are distributed.
Yeah.
And people are feeling a little bit kind of like separate from each other. So far on this podcast, we've been talking about, remote teams, distributed teams, them coming together in real life for, holidays together in a way, or working holidays kind of thing, offsites. That's what we facilitate a lot. The ones here in Toronto are not so much like, beachy-tastic. People are not, they're drinking cocktails at the end of the day, but not in the beginning of the morning.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting that, a podcast is a project for a team that is distributed where everyone can contribute to it. Would be amazing, not only for like keeping them in the loop, but for team building.
Yeah.
Have you had requests for that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, and I've also consulted with companies that have been experimenting with this. And so one of them being Kobo, who was trying to really get their own team involved. And this was a external podcast, Kobo in Conversation, but they did this kind of behind the scenes episode where they went around the office and just asked everyone what their favorite book was and what they wanted, or what book they were asking for around the holidays or something. And they made this really neat montage. And then suddenly you got all of these people sharing that episode on. They're like, oh, this was our highest performing episode. I said, well, of course it was. Yeah. You got every single person sharing it because they got to hear their voice, even if it was just for, 5-10 seconds.
Yeah.
And so taking that approach to having people contribute and bringing things together, it just gives people a real voice and makes them feel excited and heard.
Totally.
Yeah.
What do you think for podcasting as a whole, at least with this lens, let's call it the kind of like corporate lens, what do you think's around the corner in terms of how businesses will be using podcasting in the next 5 years?
I think... maybe I'm biased because, I see a lot of potential in this space. And now will people actually jump on and do it? Let's see. Right. But there's some really neat AI technology that's being developed, including some from Lead Podcasting.
What? You're developing AI technology? Oh, that's great. This is the new zeitgeist. Everyone's like, oh yeah, I got some AI for this. I'm working on some AI for that. Blockchain was the other day. I'm done with that blockchain stuff. So.
Well, it's like every entrepreneur, which you'll get. You look, you see a problem, and you go, how can we solve it? And I didn't foresee myself getting into this space, but here I am. But one of the community give back projects we did. This is where it started from, but I assure you, we'll get back to internal podcasting. Okay. Stay with me on this. It started from the problem of people coming to me saying, I want to record loved ones before they go.
Oh, wow.
Or I have recorded and I have 10 hours and now what do I do with all of this?
Yeah.
And I would be like, send it to me. I'll edit for you. I'd feel so bad. People attending my workshops and asking me these sorts of questions. And so I just thought there's got to be a tech solution to this. And so I worked with two developers, Jake and Troy, shout out to them, in coming up with this technology that pieces together a podcast episode for you automatically. And so it's rememberthispodcast.com. It's browser-based. So you go in and there's 10 questions, just general questions about your life, and you just hit record. You could skip over questions you don't want to do. And at the end, you just click mix, and it mixes it down with music automatically and voice narration from me.
Okay.
As a host. And so at the end, you have this little episode teeing up this person, their age. And
That's
then
so cool.
It's beautiful. And so then at the end of it all, you can save it for yourself, just keep it. Or you could submit it to the podcast. So we have a podcast that goes hand in hand with it called Remember This.
Wow.
And so it's this collection of amazing stories of people who have used this app and we've gotten such wonderful feedback. We just wrapped up season 2. It was nominated for a Canadian Podcast Award.
Congratulations.
So thank
this
you.
is such an interesting project.
Yeah, it was so beautiful. And so the podcast was a mix of these auto-generated episodes plus original interviews we did with elderly folks around, and we did some pro bono workshops in long-term care facilities and got people to share their story. So it's this really beautiful mix of just people sharing stories, memories that deserve to live forever, which is the tagline of the show.
I like that.
Yeah, so it was really beautiful. And so as we put this out there, it's free, and a true community give back. And so that's out there. And as this is out there, I'm thinking this would be so brilliant.
You could use it for so many different contexts.
So many things, and like an internal podcast where a CEO sits down and records those 10 questions like I did once. And then any new employee that comes in gets to choose which ones they want to answer and way to onboard someone. And instead of that get to know you, slideshow or, every company does something different, you could have them just answer whatever questions they like and pump it out as an internal podcast. Yeah. The CEO is getting voice time, but only has to sit down for one recording. And then it's automatically, there's no editing that you'll have to do. It just turns it out, right? Automated. And there is the ability to just have it actually publish right away too, and have it connected to a website, and it's just all a click of a button. And so in 5 years, I would love to see something like that being used by HR teams and internal. Like, I just think there's such a strong internal business case for something like that. Yeah.
Are you ready for test cases for if people having, because
if they do come, because I've had a lot of curiosity around it, but no one's really, there's not pulling the trigger. I know it's tough, and you got to commit to it in order to, and you can't just, a lot of businesses, if they're not sure about it, they want to dip their toe in. We're doing a 6-episode miniseries. We're doing and this is the kind of thing where you got to be feeling pretty confident with testing this.
Yeah.
Because we're going to build you a whole thing. But the team is ready if anyone wants in.
There you go. All our audience is probably pretty piqued in interest right now, because the bulk of the Gathering podcast and Gathering series audience are people who support people, right? And people who develop solutions that make their people's lives better. HR people and other supports, EAs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So on that note, how do people get in touch with you?
You can email me, amanda@leadpodcasting.com, where you can find me on social. I'm pretty much on everything if you look up Amanda Cupido.
And before we call it quits, I want to hear a little bit more on the journey since Lead Podcasting was founded.
Yes.
And the question of scale and where you want your company to be in the next few years.
Well, it's a good question, and not to deviate too far from the podcast conversation, but it's so hard as an entrepreneur. I want to scale in so many ways. I have so many ideas. But I have, really hit a great rhythm with what the company is doing right now. We have a small but mighty team. We're usually producing about 7 podcasts at any given time. Yeah, it's good.
Wow, congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. So we're busy. It's great. And so we have the accelerator program there. We have this AI kind of on the side. We'll see what happens with that. But between the original series and the accelerator program, we're in a really good rhythm. And I was looking at scaling internationally and helping, businesses that want an English podcast from other countries.
Okay.
But I've paused on that just because I have taken another role with a radio station. So
back to radio.
Back full circle.
Wow.
I just love audio.
So what are you doing for which station?
So it's 640 Toronto. Many people know it as AM 640.
Okay.
I'm the program director there. So
congratulations.
Thank you. So I'm more advising on the lead podcasting side. I have my team in place. It's in a good position. And, my day-to-day is at the radio station now. And it's a really interesting time where people go, oh, radio's dead and it's all podcasting. And it's like, no, I just completely disagree. And I see this world where there is both, and they both offer such different things.
Oh, for sure.
And I'm so happy to be at this intersection of creating audio for podcasts, but then also really, creating a new era of talk radio in Toronto and in Canada. And so I started that role in January, and I've been there ever since. And it's and it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely someone who would agree with you. One of our favorite magazines here on campus is Monocle magazine, and Monocle's editorial board has been adamant, I think, in pursuing a multi-channel strategy that's kind of counterintuitive from day one, where it was, audio was the thing that they backed, and they have a radio station or stations. They have podcasts that really, I think, is for the most part, they're the shows that go on the station are podcasted.
Okay.
So people could kind of like jump into just that particular show if they want.
Cool.
As far as I understand it. And I love that idea, and then even the idea of kind of like other media, like, written word and photography and video accessorizing the audio world. They don't need to be the other way around, especially where I kind of am feeling that people are like burnt out with visual medium. It tires you out.
Yeah.
Listening takes less energy.
Yes.
Than listening and watching.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's this magic to radio where it's urgent and immediate.
Yeah.
And very different from podcasting, right? Yeah. And so it's like playing into the sweet spots of that medium, and not trying to be all things to all people and have the video and the photo and the social. Like, it's like, let's do a couple things really well, and let's lean into what this medium is offering.
Yeah.
And yes, there's going to be some overlap where we can repurpose, but we got to tweak it so that it makes sense for what we're doing, where people are actually digesting it.
So your cliff notes on top trends in talk radio as of now?
Right now, I would say a lot of people associate talk radio with angry radio, hanging up on callers.
People calling to complain about things.
And just,
or sports.
Right? Heavy on the sports.
Or like dumb people in the morning. Empty heads.
Yes.
Talking about nothing because their listeners are just trying to get their coffee in their system and get going.
Right? All of that. You're not alone.
The 80s basically is what we're describing.
So we're really trying to flip it on its head. And we go, okay, we want a place where people can come to find common ground. We're not hanging up on people. We're actually trying to bring people together. You can get into a, echo chamber, as we know. And it's like, wow, imagine a place where you're going to be able to come and not start a massive fight, but really just come together and have a great discussion about something. Wow, it shouldn't be such a shock, but we're really lacking it in the audio space and the radio space, but media as a whole for sure. Come together, learn something. So the call letters have recently changed since I've been at the station. It is now CFIQ, emphasis on the IQ, because we really want listeners to come in and feel like they walked away learning something. So no more of those empty heads. It's informed opinions and probably multiple angles. And then you choose where you want to land. We're not here to just pitch you on something, but we're coming together and really having, interesting discussions with really strong takeaways and changing the face of what radio looks like. And so right now our lineup has more women than men. Shocking weekday lineup. Not the norm. Even me, I am the first woman program director for a talk station in Toronto. Ever.
What?
I know.
I won't even say congratulations. I'll just
sad.
say to everyone before you, I'm going to say, what?
Yeah, exactly.
Jeez.
And so, and so that's why there's just like it's time. It's been a long time coming. And so already I think, I've been able to start. And also just like having fun again. I think we've gotten really bogged down with the news.
And
it's like
everything gets very serious.
And heavy. And it's like we could also still have fun.
Yeah.
and
totally.
Try things and invite people to call in and engage with them. And, sometimes too, we're so used to like a million calls in a segment. Maybe we just get one caller who's so interesting that we let them have the segment.
Right.
And encouraging the team to really lean into their gut, try new things. Including what our digital presence looks like, but even on the air, and just get back to some of those basics.
Okay, and last question on this note, because I think there's tons to talk about radio, and we'll have to do another show about that. But radio going digital there's been, all these startups and now LinkedIn as well. I think it has a platform like Clubhouse was what everyone's kind of saying they copycatted.
Yeah.
For the idea of, live audio channels that can be multi-participant online.
Yes. I know. I mean, so it's social audio, as people in the industry like to refer to it. Maybe controversial, but I don't like it and we saw this happen with Clubhouse. And anytime I tried
to sticky.
No, and there's a lot of riffraff that end up, and it's hard to go through. It's not carefully curated, but then this moment you start curating it, you're like, who's in charge of the curation? And it's like, it just ends up getting a bit messy. And I think for some instances, it can be good if you want to have like the AMA chats on Reddit and you want to do that live.
Right.
Great. And you want to use it as a way to talk back. But as a regular episodic or daily thing, well, let's just say we're not the radio station is set up for success in that area. And if you look at the teams that are behind that, you understand why those people are there and why what ends up coming out on the airwaves is so strong versus what you might be getting from a social audio perspective. Sure. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Lots of interesting tidbits. I think particularly this idea of podcasts for internal communication at companies is something I'm going to be mulling over for quite a while.
Yeah.
I love it. And hopefully we'll have you speak at our gathering conference in April.
I would love to.
Excellent.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers.